All right, so let's now deal with the Maryland football team that USC is going to face. So, obviously the Northwestern game wasn't representative of most Maryland games. What do you think, like, kind of the average Maryland performance is this season, and how likely do you think we're going to see something close to the mean? I think the Northwestern was an outlier. What's like a general baseline of what to expect from Maryland each week?
Well, excuse me. The scary thing with them, as you well know, like, how replicable are turnovers on a week-to-week? So they were plus 11 through 5 games. They were minus 4 last week. So that has something to do with what happened, obviously. I think that I'm sorry. I think they happen to be a team that's capable of staying in most games. I think that the clear shortcomings that they have seen so far this year are up front with a rebuilt offensive line, a story as old as time, and a secondary that, has graduated a fair bit of talent. They were down Dante Trader Jr., the safety, this past week, and it did not go well. Northwestern had 4 passes of at least 28 yards, and that's not exactly the most potent passing attack that anybody is going to see. Credit them for getting stuff done, but it was not a great performance by Maryland. So, I think those are the things that if you're USC, you would like to see your defensive line play well. You would like to see your receivers be able to make some plays, because I think those are Maryland's vulnerabilities. I think on offense, Ty Felton has had a fabulous year, the wideout. Didn't have an explosive play last week coming back from injury, but I do think that that's probably the place that Maryland has the best chance to do something, is in the passing game with Felton and with a few other guys, with Billy Edwards Jr. Doing his thing. And he got a little antsy last week, but he's generally been pretty solid for them. Not a guy that's going out and putting up Tagovailoa numbers, but certainly somebody that's had a good, solid season as a first-time starter.
You've talked about some of Maryland's vulnerabilities. What do you think Maryland can exploit with USC? And, as we started the show, we mentioned that today, 2 big pieces of news for USC, that defensive end Anthony Lucas and linebacker Eric Gentry both out for the season. Lucas with the injury that he suffered against Minnesota 2 weeks ago, and he aggravated it against Penn State. And Gentry, as had been rumored for the past few weeks, injured against Wisconsin, and he has a concussion, and he's just not going to be able to play the rest of the season. He played only 4 games, so he could preserve his red shirt, and he announced just this evening that he's going to red shirt, so he's not playing the rest of the season. So how do you think that changes the equation for Maryland? And if you are Loxley, what do you think that changes in terms of your game plan, if anything, against the Trojans?
Truthfully, if I'm Maryland right now, coming off the performance that I just had, I'm much more worried about just getting myself right. I don't know if it really feels like one of those games where you're just worried about making sure you're doing the stuff you're supposed to do after having a performance where so much went wrong. And yeah, maybe that's an opportunity to have a little bit more time in the pocket. That would certainly help. But I think more than anything for Maryland right now, is worrying about Maryland and trying to figure out how to get things on track. Just because when you start looking at that schedule, they're not looking at it, but you can start doing the math where it's at Minnesota, bye week, at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, at Penn State. They need to get right themselves to have a chance to win this game. And winning this game is pretty important, just simply because it is a team coming from the West Coast, and that hasn't gone very well so far for these Big Ten newcomers. So I think this feels much more like a sort of a gut check game for Maryland than anything really X's and O's related.
And kind of piggybacking on what you've just said, this is a gut check game. I mean, my instinct is that, knowing Maryland the way I do, I think Maryland gets up for this game. I think Maryland's going to be feisty in this game, at least for 2.5, maybe even 3 quarters. Because again, Maryland plays the big boys tough. Maryland puts up a fight. It's the Northwesterns and the other teams where Maryland really loses focus. So do you pretty much share that view that like late in the third quarter, this game's going to be close and competitive?
I do. I actually think that Maryland will be in this. And I think too, like, I haven't watched as much USC as you have, obviously. But I watched a fair bit of the team 2 years ago when they were pretty good. And that was a fun team. They didn't play much defense, but they got away with it. And then last year, there were enough nights that I had to stay up late to see, okay, is USC going to mess this up in this 10:30 window or not? And, the unmistakable sense that I took from it was like, this team isn't like, this defense in particular isn't very well coached, and they're not very disciplined, and they're not very technically sound. And, you're wondering, how much do these guys really want to be there? And I don't sense that from this USC team. I don't think I think there's maybe some talent limitations on the defensive end, but I don't think it's like last year where you're just like, do these guys even want to be here? So I do think Maryland, especially if they can do what they did in the middle part of the game the other night, which was they had, I think it was a 14-play touchdown drive and a 16-play field goal drive or something, or 16 and 18, where they were able to control the clock. And, they would love to have a few more big plays, but that was actually not a terrible way for them to kind of get themselves a little bit of equilibrium after a slow start. I mean, they're down 17-0. They got to within 17-10. And then the fourth quarter was just a mess with the turnovers. So I do think it'll be a better version of Maryland this week. I do think that sort of embarrassment probably got everybody's attention. That already, even before Friday last week, Mike Loxley had taken the play calling duties away from offensive coordinator Josh Gaddis. So there's a little bit of a different element to that as well. And so I do think Maryland plays better. I don't know if it's enough to win, but I certainly would expect them to acquit themselves better. They usually haven't, under Loxley, had 2 true duds in a row unless there was a real injury issue in there.
Okay, winding down our segment with Patrick Stevens. Just a couple more items before we let you go. Want to honor your time tonight on the East Coast. Is there a specific one-on-one matchup that you think is particularly central to this game? Like if one team wins this matchup or loses it, like that could swing the pendulum in one direction or another.
Yeah, I think if Felton can get going, the Maryland receiver Ty Felton, I think that would really, really help out. And when you look back to last week, his longest catch last week was 13 yards. And this was a guy who would come in leading the Big Ten in receptions, leading the Big Ten in receiving yards. He still does, but he got to that point by having a fair number of big plays, and they just simply did not stretch the field very well in the passing game. So if they can do that, they're going to have a much better chance than if they're trying to dink and dunk. I pointed out those long drives. The truth of the matter is that it's probably not going to be as doable to have long drives against USC as it was Northwestern. Although that was a feisty Northwestern team that they came out and had a gut check type game last week, and maybe Maryland is able to do a little bit more damage against USC. Maybe not. I think it's probably a gut check game for USC too after the last 2 weeks.
Absolutely. All right. Last question, Patrick. Whenever I talk to Big Ten writers or people who cover Big Ten schools, especially in this 2024 season, the first season of the geographically expanded Big Ten, want to get a sense of what people think about the new reality of travel and time zones. And you briefly alluded to this, that the multiple time zone travel has not been kind to teams in the Big Ten so far this season. With all that in mind, how disappointed are Maryland fans that this is not a noon game? And we all remember, and I know you remember this. I remember
California.
Cal, the Kevin Riley, Jeff Tedford, Cal had just completely body snatched. And I know that Maryland fans remember that. That
was at the beginning of the 2008 season. I think it was the second week of the season. And the memorable part of that was that Cal flew out on Friday, which wasn't very smart.
Nope.
Like everybody, at least in the Big Ten right now, is like, well, we're going out at least 2 days early. And, the Big Ten, to its credit, has done a fair bit of scheduling so that teams are coming out of their byes and doing that sort of travel coming out of their byes. Like Maryland's going to go to Oregon early next month coming out of an open date. So, yeah, that is probably the last West Coast team to have come in. I know that was Cal was, the body clocks were not right. They got them back the next year. It was a 10:30 game out in Berkeley, and Maryland, we're talking about a Maryland team that doesn't have an offensive line or has a new offensive line. That was the exact same thing in 2009. And they went out there, and I think the final was like 51-13 or something along those lines that was thoroughly uncompetitive. So, I think, it's funny. UCLA is getting those noon kickoffs, and USC is getting treated a little bit better when it comes east.
Not that it's helping USC much to this point, but the final item is, Maryland hasn't yet had a late, 11 p.m. game at Washington, at Oregon, UCLA, USC. What's been the discussion around Maryland for when that eventually happens? Obviously, it's not an immediate point of concern, but what has been the discussion in college?
I don't know if there has been much, just because, their only trip out west this year is to Oregon, and that's probably not going to be a late night game. So, sorry. But I suspect that it'll be one of those things where you just kind of have to roll with it. Everybody's going to have to take their turn. It's funny. You're sitting there thinking about like the schools that refuse to play on Friday nights and whatnot, and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, you're going to have to take your turn doing this no matter what, no matter how snotty you want to be. So, I think that if you're like, let's say Rutgers, which is going out west, it's coming to USC next week, right, for an 11 o'clock Friday night game. I think you'd almost rather do it coming out of a bye. I think they're coming out of a bye, but it's definitely, you get the extra time going back. You'd probably rather do it on Friday than on Saturday. 11 o'clock Saturday would be pretty rough, especially if you have to go back east and play the next week. So it's one of those things where you're almost trying to guess, where are we going to shortchange ourselves? Where are we going to cheat ourselves and hamstring ourselves for 1 week or another? So just a wonderful, wonderful mess, thanks to the world of college sports in 2024.
Well, Patrick, you're wonderful. No mess involved there. Patrick Stevens of the Washington Post, Blue Ribbon College Basketball, also covers college lacrosse as well. One of the best sports journalists in the United States. Very honored to have you on our program here with USC at the Voice of College Football. Patrick, all success covering Maryland and all the other sports that you cover in the DMV and elsewhere. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.